here with you, man.
Okay.
It's
funny. I'm on the podcast. This is actually real.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Do you know Mike Myers? Probably.
Yeah, sure.
The guy who was Shrek and Austin Powers and all those great movies.
Yeah.
He just came out with a new TV show on Netflix.
Okay.
Called The Pentaverant.
Oh.
It's like a spoof on like the Illuminati.
Yeah.
And like he plays every character in the Illuminati.
Oh, okay.
And he's supposed to, I don't think he's actually Canadian, but he's playing like a Canadian character.
He's from Toronto.
Oh, he is? Yeah. Okay. Well, he's playing a Canadian character in the TV show. And it's one of the worst TV shows I've ever seen. Okay. And I feel like he's doing Canada so bad in it. It's so they have the craziest accents. Like they're like over exaggerating everything. Sure. And then like there's this one scene, I forget her name. She's this newer actress.
Okay.
And this is kind of a spoiler. Basically, it turns out that the actress, whatever, the supporting actress, she's like a double agent. Oh, fuck. This is really bad. I'm spoiling it. But she's a double agent, and she's not actually from Canada, and she has to practice becoming a Canadian to trick the Canadians. Okay. And there's like a scene of her like being like, "Oh, sorry about that," and it's like fucking really going into the stereotypes. Yeah. And so I've been watching that, even though it's a terrible. I'm sorry, Mike Myers. It's not that good of a show. Like it's rated like 20% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Sure.
And I like corny stuff too, but it's not it. But like I've been watching that for like a week now. It's like one of those. I don't know if you have any like shows you hate watch ever, but
sure. I just watched like multiple seasons of Selling Sunset.
Okay.
Which is a show I just love because it's so amazing to heckle.
I need to watch that. That's the reality. What is that? What realtor show, right?
Yeah,
that's so funny.
And it's just a bunch of women who are selling like $20 million houses in LA and are just gossiping about each other in the office, and that's the whole show. Like it's just, and so every scene is two people sitting at a cafe table talking about some other person who's not there. And then later, like two other people talking about those people having had a coffee like without them. Yeah. And they said this, and there's so much they said, she said, he said, and the real estate, like you never find out. Like they list houses, they show houses, you never find out if anything gets sold or really? What happens. Like it's really just about the inter-office gossip.
That's hilarious. But yeah, basically, I think because I watch all that Canadian stuff, and now I have a Canadian.
Sure.
Oh my gosh, you might be the first Canadian in person in the studio. Oh my gosh.
I guess so.
So you're originally from Canada.
I am.
What part of Canada?
So I was born in this town called Brantford,
okay,
which is about an hour from Toronto.
Okay.
And so Brantford is noted for a bunch of historical things. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in Brantford. Which brought about the age of modern technology. The telephone was invented, and suddenly we had the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And Phil Hartman, the comedian, was from Brantford.
Okay.
Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, he was from Brantford. And he actually grew up with my brothers. I have 2 siblings. I have 3 siblings. I have 2 brothers who are older than me, and they were the same age as Wayne Gretzky. So they went to public school with him. They like played, baseball and soccer in the park with Wayne Gretzky.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was like a teenager, Wayne had just signed his first big NHL deal, and he got a Ferrari as like a signing bonus. And so Brantford's not a big place, and so this Ferrari, you'd see it driving around town, like you knew Wayne was in town. And me and my friends, we were like out, I'm Canadian, so we played like hockey in the street. Like it was just,
Very stereotypical.
We like put a couple nets in the street and just like you yell car, and you have to move all the nets and then keep playing. And at one point, like the black Ferrari pulled up like beside us.
Oh wow.
And I guess one of Wayne's friends like lived across the street or something. And so he like, stopped, he got out of his car, he like gave us a thumbs up, which we thought as like, whatever 11-year-olds, 10-year-olds, it was like a huge deal that like Wayne Gretzky had endorsed our hockey playing. And like we were next for the NHL.
Yeah.
And I remember my mom like immediately came out and like made us stop playing because she didn't want us to hit the car. And like, who knows what a headlight of a Ferrari costs.
Did any of you guys become NHL players?
No. No, not at all.
So, how long were you living in Canada for?
So, I mean, I moved to Seattle in 2012.
Oh,
so
somewhere.
So most of my life was in Canada. Like I grew up in Canada. I grew up in Toronto. I grew up like I went to university in Canada. I've lived all over the place.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I grew up in Brantford. I went to university in a place called Hamilton, which is about half an hour. It's sort of halfway between Brantford and Toronto.
Okay.
And then after university,
Wait, what'd you go to school for?
Oh, that's a good question. So I went to school. My education background is really odd. So in high school, I was flagged for this special program, which was called Talent Pool. And it was this experiment in education where they cherry picked a bunch of kids who, I don't know, did well on some aptitude tests or whatever. So grades like 9, 10, 11, and 12, I was put into this experimental high school program, which was all self-learning. So I didn't have any classes. I didn't have any exams or tests. And we, as this group of 30 students, taught each other topics. So we would have a class on medieval history, and everybody in the class would just pick something that interested them about medieval history. And you'd be like 16. You'd go learn about castles and how castles worked, and then you'd have to present what you learned to the other students in the class. So when I was, we were just talking about this. You're 21.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about this time in my life because a lot happened to me at that time in my life, which I'll talk about.
Yeah.
Is that so I came out of this schooling into like regular high school. In my last year, I like did regular high school because they decided to end this program, whatever. I don't know what happened, but we were sort of just thrown back into regular high school.
No more medieval classes for you guys.
but it was really hard that year because we hadn't had any structure in our education for 4 years. And suddenly it was like, I got to do this test. I got to like, write this exam. I got to actually like go to class. Like it was a really like shocking thing for me. But I also really was like an extremely ambitious kid. And so that year I ran for school president and won. I was like a star soccer player on the soccer team. I was the head of the debate club. I ran the school poetry journal.
Dang.
I ran like I was in the chess club. Like I was the lead in the school play. Like they sort of trained us in this program to be like really ambitious, like self-starters.
Wow.
And it's almost like when we got thrown back into the regular pool of students, we were just like terrors because we were like, I'm going to figure this out and I'm going to do really well at it. So, I mean, in that way, it was kind of an interesting program to have gone through, but it's something that when I think back on it and I talk to other people about their high school experience, I'm just like, oh, wow, my high school was really strange. Like,
did you think you were any type of a leader before you went to that program, or do you think it taught you to become a leader?
I think it very much did. It taught us to be leaders, and it also kind of screwed us up a little bit. Like after high school, I went to university, and I went to University of Fine Art and Japanese.
Oh wow!
So I was like taking classes in Japanese. I was doing painting and drawing in school, and when I was 20, my dad died from cancer. It was unexpected. Just sort of one day, he got a notice like, Jeez. You've got a tumor. It's malignant. He died 4 months later.
Jeez.
And it was awful. I was 20, so it was like really shocked for me.
Yeah.
And I was in school. And
wait, were you living with family still at that time?
I had just moved out to residence,
okay.
So I was living in residence at university. So I wasn't paying a lot of attention to what the day to day, like what was happening with my parents, I guess. So it was a big shock for me when I was 20. I dropped out of art school almost immediately afterwards because I just found I couldn't paint and draw. I was just not happy. It wasn't, not that you need to be happy to paint and draw, but I was just found art classes really hard. I actually ended up getting a university degree in Zen Buddhism.
Oh,
so I took Zen Buddhism in school, and ultimately that's what I have a university degree in.
What? That's insane.
And but then, so I graduated. I was 22.
Yeah. And
just as I was graduating, my mom died.
Oh shit.
And I suddenly was like 22. You're 21. So and I was like, okay, what do I do with my life? Like
Yeah.
I have a degree in Zen Buddhism, and I don't know what to do with myself. Like,
Yeah.
and I don't have a home to go back to. And so I traveled a lot. Like I ended up just becoming a bit of a nomad for a few years. I
Damn.
moved to Quebec. I lived in like outside of Montreal. I moved out west and I lived on Vancouver Island, like the north end of Vancouver Island for a while in Canada. Still in Canada. I moved to France. I lived in like the Alps in France for a year, and I did a lot of skiing and figuring out myself, I guess.
Wow.
And then eventually, like I sort of settled in back in Ontario near where I grew up, and I got a job at an ad agency, and I worked in advertising.
Whoa, wait, how do you go from your college degree and being like, have you seen Doctor Strange?
No, I haven't seen it, no. But
In I think the first Doctor Strange movie, like he is trying to learn how to use like the mystical powers or whatever,
Sure.
but to do that, like he needs to like find inner peace and all this.
yeah.
So he goes and like lives in the Alps and there's all this craziness.
Yeah,
But-
that's pretty much my life. That was what I did for. I actually always feel bad for like, to like friends I had in that time period, like girls I dated,
Yeah.
like because I was so like in need of like family roots and foundations. So
Yeah.
like everyone I met was like, "You're gonna be my best friend forever."
Oh,
We're gonna be together forever. And it was just like I put a lot of pressure on a lot of like relationships in that time period because I didn't know how to be.
what
by
about like
myself.
siblings?
Like,
Any siblings?
yeah, so I have 3 siblings. They're all quite a bit older than me.
Mm.
So my sister is 8 years older than me, Melanie. My 2 brothers, Ian and Neil, are 12 and 13 years older than me.
Jeez.
So growing up, like they were around when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
But through those kind of teen years where you really form your identity, it was just me and my parents at home. And so, yeah, so it was kind of an interesting, like that was a really like influential time in my life to think about like, what am I doing now? And how do I kind of move forward? And what am I going to do with my time?
Do you think they realized how hard that was for you, your siblings?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But at the same time, I also think everybody wasn't quite sure what to do. Like,
Right.
It's
Jeez.
not. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a time. I mean, I don't like, I'm not, it was a long time ago. So
Wow.
like, but it was like a lot happened in the time period when I was, 20 to 22 years old.
Yeah.
And then, really it took a while. I met my wife. I mean, we started dating when I was 25. So, and then we got married when I was 30 and we've been together ever since.
Wow.
We've been together 23 years, 24 years.
Jeez.
So, yeah, it's,
So what did you have like money to live, or were you working at jobs when you were traveling like a nomad?
yeah, I mean, I did somewhat. Like I did a bunch of random jobs. So here's the other thing, which is strange. So I'm 49,
Okay.
and the thing that I want to talk to you about, like, because we were talking a little bit before we started talking here about like the pandemic and growing up in the last few years through the pandemic. For me, when I was 21, it was 1994. The internet did not exist. So you gotta think about this for a second. There was no email. There was no websites. I mean, they existed, but like no one used the internet. No one knew what it was. And I remember in that last year of university, when I was studying Buddhism, that a friend of mine was like, "Hey, you can get an email address." And I was like, "Why would I get an email address?" And so he was like, "You got a free email address as a student." And so like he was the only other person I knew who had an email address.
Yeah.
And he's my roommate.
Yeah.
So we would like, "Oh, okay, I will go to the computer lab. I'm going to log into this terminal at the computer lab. I'm going to write you an email. And then I'm going to hope that you at some point during the day also go to a computer lab and check this email that I'm not going to be, I don't know, home for dinner or something. Otherwise, I guess you'll just figure it out."
Yeah.
Like it was funny that those early days of like there not being any internet. And but then what happened is that, in 95, so like when I was first kind of figuring myself out, I got a job at like an internet company that was like helping people get internet accounts. Like what, and like there was a whole sales pitch of like why would you want to be on the internet? Why would you need an email address? And you'd be like calling people, cold calling people and saying, hey, there's this new thing called the internet. You should check it out. Like,
Jeez.
we have a package. We can sell you the internet for whatever it was, $10 a month. And you can log in and use email. And people were like, why would I want any of this? Like,
yeah.
And so, I don't know. It was an interesting time. Like,
but how do you convince people that the internet's essential at that point?
I don't know. I wasn't very good at the job. It didn't last long. It was like telemarketing. So it was, but then, yeah,
Wow.
I mean, I traveled around. I worked for this magazine. So I got this job. One of my first real like jobs that like started my career.
Yeah.
Came from kind of a friend of a friend. Someone introduced me to someone who had started a magazine about divorce.
Yeah.
So this is a crazy story. This is somebody who had previously worked for like a wedding magazine. So wedding magazines are an interesting industry because someone buys a wedding magazine for kind of the 6 months to a year before they get married.
Mm.
And then they get married and they don't resubscribe to the magazine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously people don't really use magazines today, but
Yeah.
in the 90s, magazines were the thing. That was how you learned about information. And so someone would buy a magazine for their wedding for a year and then they would unsubscribe. And so wedding magazines would often recycle content. So they would run the same articles, 2 years later because they knew almost none of the same people were going to have seen the same article. And this guy had recently gotten divorced and he worked for a wedding magazine. And he's like, we should create a magazine for divorce because people for the year in and around when they decide they're going to get divorced will need help. Like, how do you get back into dating? How can you pick the right divorce lawyer? How do you manage, time with your kids? And like, he thought this advice would be really helpful.
Yeah.
And so my first job was working for this divorce magazine and I didn't have any skills at all. Like, I didn't know how to do any computer stuff. And I was like a kid with an art degree. Like I'd done art in school. I had the Zen Buddhism degree. Like, I was ambitious, but I had no actual skills.
Yeah.
And they took me on and I was like a real, trial by fire. I just learned how to use, I was like writing stories for them initially. And then it was such a small operation. Everyone would have to lay out their own stories in the magazine.
And where were you living at this point?
So I was living in Toronto.
Toronto again. Okay.
And so we would create these stories. And then, I was really good at the layouts.
Yeah.
So I started having all these little side trades with people that I worked with. Like, okay, well, you can write my story for me and then I'll lay out your story for you.
Yeah.
And pretty soon I was the guy who was designing the magazine. And so yeah, it was, I did that for a while. And then I went to France.
Did you speak the language?
Yeah, I mean, in Canada.
Oh yeah, what am I talking about? Yeah.
Well, in Canada, you have to take French.
French Canadians.
By law, you have to take French until you're 16. So
really?
So like everyone in school learns basic French.
Wow.
I'll also say what's interesting about living in Canada is that all the packaging, like milk and bread and everything, is French on one side. So like when you buy things in the shelf, like on a grocery store shelf, you'll buy this product and if you turn it around, it's got French on the other side. And so there's a lot of French you just pick up through osmosis because you're just exposed to it all the time. But then I took French in school. Like I was interested in French. I was interested in learning French. And so like I took French classes and but living in an environment like living in France, that was the big thing for me was that when I was living in France, I would like take packages off the shelf and turn them around and be like, it's still in French. I don't actually know what this is. Like, but you learn a language very quickly when you live there, and you learn how to order coffee. You learn how, because if you want coffee, you have to learn how to order it. Otherwise, you're not going to get it.
Wait, so when you were moving around, you had friends and like relationships, or were you like, was it hard to make any? Like you said, you kind of grew attached to people, or what was that like?
I mean, sure. I mean, I went to France because my girlfriend at the time was doing her master's degree in France. And so I went to France with her because she was going to school. And so I took French classes. Like I went to university and I took French classes and I learned about French history around the world and the history of the French language in places like Quebec and countries in Africa where they speak French and different like unique ways that French, like in Belgium, they use slightly different numbers in French than they use in other parts of they use in France. So you had to learn all these little things. Like, it's things like in America, like people on the West Coast say hella.
Yeah.
or, y'all. Like there's all these words that I've picked up living in the US that aren't like, like they're almost like the most American words.
Yeah.
But I never said them when I was living in Canada. Like
Yeah.
but it's like now I'm like, oh, I gotta say hello all the time because I live on the West Coast. Like,
Yeah.
Like, show off.
Yeah, that's so crazy that you're talking about how those times were very like pivotal for you though. Like,
Sure.
I don't know, maybe it's I don't want to think about it, or maybe because I'm living through it, I don't think about it. But either way, I've never really paid attention that this is probably a very pivotal time in my life.
Sure.
Like, I did have, maybe this is an epiphany. I was telling my friends the other day that I don't think I've ever had a real epiphany.
Okay.
But I think the other day I had an epiphany about, I don't even know if it's the right use of the word epiphany.
Sure.
But I remember when I was like 12, okay? Yeah. And I would get grounded or whatever the situation was.
Yeah.
And I would be like, in 7 years or whatever, I don't even remember this or care about this anymore. And then, like 7 years or however long go by. And now I'm here thinking about when I guess that wasn't, I'd be, okay, if I was 12, let's say 9 years ago then. So like in those 9 years, I look back on it, I'm like, yeah, that wasn't really that important. But it's just interesting to be where exaggeration in my mind where I was like, in 9 years, this won't matter at all. And now 9 years later, here I am. So it's interesting to think that.
But those events have also like still, they still come up. Like, like you're still thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like like those events shape you, those random things that like, it's funny. Like there's things that like happened to you when you were a child that like come back to haunt you that you just think about, like
trauma.
Yeah. We think about aging and it's like, in my head, I'm still that same person. Like I'm not, like I don't feel like I'm 49, but I don't feel like I'm any different than I was when I'm the same person I was when I was 21. Like but I think about how like when I was a kid, there was some like jerk that I went to public school with, and he like teased me about my walk. Like, I don't know why. Like, it's just, I was a kid. Like, I walked like any other kid. Like, but he was like, oh, you got a weird walk. And like, I was like so paranoid that like I walked weird, that I like spent a lot of time like trying to like work on my walk. Like, it's like whatever. I'm like 10 years old. I'm like working on my walk. Cause I walk normal and stiff or whatever. And, but like this summer, or like recently, I guess, my knee started hurting. Like I just have this like random knee pain.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh crap. And I went to see the doctor about it, and I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, oh, you just have to like, you have to walk differently to like, it's just mechanical. Like it's just 49 years of use. Like, and so I think back now, I'm like, it's like I'm 10 years old again, and I'm like trying to learn how to walk differently. Like, so I'm like, my knee doesn't hurt. Like, it's just
shit.
It's funny. Like you just go through these loops. You just do the same things over and over again.
Damn. I hope this doesn't come off as dark, but do you think in a way it was kind of important for what happened with your parents to shape who you are now? Or do you think your life would have been completely different if they were still alive? Do you think you would have traveled at all or anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually something I think about a lot. Like and I gotta be honest, like if that hadn't happened to me, like so many choices I made would have been made differently. Yeah. I mean, just times when I was by myself and I could choose to do something crazy, like, and I did, like and like I drove across the country. Like I drove when I went out to BC the first time, I just drove in my car. Like I was like, hey, I'm going to go to BC. Like I had some friends, so the very early days of the internet, like I met a girl like on the internet. Like she was one of the few people I knew who had an email address. Yeah. Like it's like, you've got an email address too. Let's hang out. But she lived in New Jersey. Oh. And so we would like email each other, like pen pal. But our lives, it was like pen pal, exactly. And my friends at one point, I was like talking, I was like waxing philosophical about like, what if this girl's the one? Like, I was very obsessed with the idea of the one, like when I was that age, and also because of the situation I'd been in. Like I was just like, I've got to find someone who's going to be the one, who's going to set everything right. And I remember my friends were like, we should just drive there. I was like, how far is New Jersey? And it was like, it's like 10 hours drive. So we just got in our car. We were at a bar. This is like a crazy story because we were like at a bar in Toronto or like outside of Toronto at like 10 o'clock at night. And it was like, let's just get in the car and drive to New Jersey. So we just got in the car, drove through the night. We had no plan, and my friends were just really into this idea. Like I was going to meet this girl.
That's romantic as
figure
fuck.
out what's going to happen.
Wow.
We only had like, this is back in the days, there was no internet. So we had like 3 cassettes like in the car, and we just played them over and over again. And we were like singing songs, like to keep ourselves awake through the drive. And we got to New Jersey, and I didn't quite know where she lived. So like I had kind of a vague sense like she was in residence at a college there. So we like went to the college and we're like asking around and like trying to find, we basically couldn't find her at the college. And so we left a note on her like door, and then we like left and we like drove. My friend was like, I want to go to Manhattan. I've never been there. So we drove to Manhattan, like, and driving around the streets of like Manhattan was crazy because we were all dumb kids, like driving around with yellow cabs, like super dangerous traffic. And of course it was like with my friend's parents' car. Like we didn't tell anybody we were going. Like finally we're like at a 7-Eleven on the side of the road, and my friend and Am's like, okay, I got to call my mom and tell her like we're in New Jersey because it's like we almost had a fender bender. And he's like, I better like cop to this whole thing. And I was like, this is a weird thing to call your mom and be like, hey, guess what? We just drove 10 hours to another country just for fun. And yeah, I don't know.
Did the girl ever get back to you though? Like,
yeah, you know, and she was just like in the next room, and we just had like, you know, ships in the night, and but you know, it wasn't a love connection. So
there we go. That's so interesting though. Like back to the family thing, because I feel like for me, I feel like maybe if you're lucky, your family should be like the most trustworthy people. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like those are the people that you bounce all your ideas off of, and you should be able to tell them like things that you wouldn't tell your friends or whatever. Like I feel like that would be like that's a great family right there, right?
Yeah.
Like being able to like truly trust your family and bounce off ideas, and if like something like maybe it's a breakup or whatever, just tell them whatever, right?
Sure.
But like and I have a mixed relationship with my family, but I think I always will I love the fact that I can bounce ideas off them, even with my, here's a little story, even with my podcast title, right? So before it was called Triple H NAST, hottest hip hop news and sneaker talk. And then the whole thing about people thought it was Triple H, like the wrestler. And then it was just and then I called it Triple H NAST, but like you couldn't, if you said Triple H NAST to Alexa or whatever, they wouldn't know what it was because it was an acronym. So they were probably thinking it's NAST or whatever, right?
Sure.
But like, honestly, like my mom was the idea who was like, maybe just cut off the H's and call it NAST podcast, right? And then of course, I have to come around to that idea. Just because she says it doesn't mean I'm going to fucking do it, right?
Sure.
So it literally took me like 3 or 4 months to really decide that's what I wanted to change, because it was like my baby at the point, you know what I mean? And the podcast is still my baby. But so it's, but I'm not close with all my family members, and I feel like, I'll always appreciate that I can bounce ideas off my mom. So I wonder what that was like. Like you literally just had to like come up with your own decisions, or did you have people you could bounce ideas off of? Like, did you tell people that you were deciding you wanted to travel the world, or like what was that? What was your community like at that point?
It's an interesting. I mean, I had a good
support
group
system
of friends at the time, and you know, people I had gone to school with. This like weird high school experience I'd had. The group of us, the sort of 30 of us who had like been like pulled off into this separate program, like we all became really tight because we were all in school with each other all day, every day. Like it was different from normal high school in that like high school, you know, you've got hundreds of students, but like there was just 30 of us in classes every day, and we were all in the same classes. So I developed a really close connection with a lot of people from that program. But you know, like I also want to acknowledge, like I don't want it to sound in any way like my siblings weren't there for me. They absolutely were, and we get along great. I think I moved out to Seattle in 2012, and so for 10 years now I've lived out on the West Coast, and so I'm several thousand miles from my siblings.
Mhm.
The 3-hour time difference between Seattle and Toronto is just enough that it's annoying. Like there's a new AJ Suede record called
Okay.
Metatron's Cube, and on that
That's a
album,
Seattle artist, by the way, guys.
yeah, and on that album he has a song called 3 Hours Late, and it's just about like having family on the East Coast, and you try to call someone, and like you wake up and you're going to call someone, but they're at lunch, and then they're going to call you back, but like you're at lunch, and it's like there's 3 hours is just this awkward amount of time. Like the number of evenings that I'm done work, I have dinner, it's 8 o'clock at night, 7:30 at night, and I think, oh, I'm going to call one of my siblings.
Yeah.
It's like, oh wait, it's 11 where they are.
Yeah.
Like it's almost midnight. Some of my siblings have kids, they're in bed, like,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot of misconnections, and
Yeah.
I'm sad about that, because I would like to be able to talk to them more, and we have to sort of find times that are actually like convenient for both of us.
Mhm.
And if we do that, it's great. But yeah, so I definitely, I hear what you're saying about this sense of like you can do anything, and who do you rely on to help you like be the ballast in your life? And I mean, today obviously I've been married for 23 years, so like my wife is a huge part of that.
It's a good person to have.
Yeah, absolutely, and she is an amazing like collaborator, partner, inspiration. She makes music, she makes art, she designs beautiful things, and so all of the work that she is doing, like she actually designed some of the record covers for Crane City music. She's done a lot of some of the marketing materials, some of the website. Like so she's also an important part of like what Crane City Music is and what we're doing with that. But just having her in my life is so important for having ballast.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I have so many ideas spinning around. I'm spinning plates like constantly, and I work all the time, and I think about stuff I could do. I have like endless lists of like half-formed ideas that will probably never happen.
Right.
And I think that's, it's a challenge to sort of decide like, what do you spend time on? What do you do? You've got this NAST podcast. Like it probably takes up a lot of your time.
My
and
fucking tired life right
yeah,
now.
but like, I think about like, why do you do it? Like, why did you start doing it?
I think it's changed. I think the answer has changed.
Sure.
But I think right now the answer is because I never felt like I had a community.
Sure.
And where I grew up, I was like one of the only black people, right? Mm-hmm. And now looking back on it, it's not like when people think of like racism, they probably are like, that guy just called that guy the N-word or whatever, right? But I feel like I don't even know. It's like subtle racism that certain people may not even realize, but like things like not getting picked for certain activities or never given like an opportunity to be in like a leadership role, which I don't want to say that's all just fucking racism, but there is a little thing where like if your entire community is like white and you're that one black guy, you're not getting chosen for anything. Like you got to think about, hey, I want an opportunity, and then you don't get it. You're like, what the fuck's going on here?
Sure.
Right. And those are just little things that like eat at the back of your head. Like I'm not someone who complains about like missed opportunities, because I feel like I really go for as any opportunity I can get. But yeah, I really felt like I didn't have a community growing up. Like I tried to be in sports, and I never made a community out of sports. I was in band, and I had some friends in band class, but I didn't have a community in band because I wasn't that passionate about playing the clarinet compared to other people, right? But I was talented. Like there was like a thing where like you had to take like practice tests to see where you placed in the program, and like I would do no practicing, and then I would just ace the fucking test. So I was musically inclined, but I wasn't passionate enough to be like, oh, let's go home and practice together or whatever, right? So that's music. There's sports. I wasn't a terrible student, but I wasn't the greatest. Probably like I don't even know what I graduated with, and I really don't care.
Sure.
But and then I got hired at 92.5 when I was in high school as a senior, and I thought I was going to find community in radio, but everyone was so much older than me
Yeah.
that there was a disconnect there with things
Yeah.
I wanted to get done or things I were excited about getting done and seeing how commercial radio works. So I never really found a community there. And while I was working at the station, I had the idea of creating the podcast. And
Yeah.
I really, the very first reason I created the podcast was to prove to the radio station that I was worthy of my voice being heard.
Sure.
Which it wasn't. And, but as I continued to do the podcast, I was like, why do I need to count on a radio station? I literally made a fucking podcast to be a resume for a radio station to hear me.
Sure.
But then I started meeting people and realizing that like all my friends were going off to college. So I had no community left in Seattle.
Yeah.
And I started becoming friends with like artists. And then I realized still no one was in my age group because artists are all ages.
Yeah.
Like I've only in the past few months found artists that are like my age.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started realizing that age really doesn't matter when forming your community. But now it's just gotten to a point where like during the pandemic, when certain people in schools had to like stay home or literally stay in school and couldn't leave school because of COVID, right? They may have lost some social skills.
Yeah.
And with me, I feel like I've gained all the social skills during the pandemic because I within the first week of the pandemic, I fucking started doing Zoom interviews. I was like, I really feel like I was one of the first people to start doing Zoom interviews during COVID. And so that's my community of artists is really what kept me sane during the pandemic. So yeah, I would say community is why I started the podcast in hopes of finding community, but not finding it. And then I realized I can make my own community and become my own leader.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I don't know. Like, I mean, in some ways, like community is the same impetus that started me getting involved in doing all the stuff I do with Seattle hip hop.
Yeah.
I mean, that for me, I moved to Seattle in 2012. I'm going to rewind that story slightly and say I was living in Toronto.
Yeah.
So kind of I did a bunch of stuff. So picking up where I left off the story, I worked in advertising for a while. I worked for another .com startup, kind of doing software design. I eventually ended up working back in magazines.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent about a decade being a magazine designer.
Wow.
So I was doing like print magazine design. And this was a kind of early, like I guess the early part of the 2000s.
Okay.
And print magazine design was like really exciting. It was like the place, being in a magazine. I was working at a big magazine in Toronto, and I worked at this company that was kind of like a Condé Nast. So it was like 12 titles under one roof.
Yeah.
It was kind of a strange like work environment because
you said Condé Nast, right?
It was like Condé Nast.
That's so funny. I don't even know what that is, but I've seen it so many times.
Yeah.
So when I created the NAST podcast, that's what I.
Sure.
What is Condé Nast? I've seen it so much.
So Condé Nast is a company that owns a whole bunch of. They own Vogue. They own GQ. They're a big magazine publisher in New York. And so they own all of these big magazine titles that you know.
Wow.
And they are like responsible for bringing all these brands, publishing the magazines every month, being the influencers they're being, putting out websites, whatever they're doing. That was kind of, for me when I was younger, like that was like the place to work.
Yeah.
Was like working at Condé Nast and being at the epitome of culture and what was happening in the world. And so in Toronto, there's a company called St. Joseph Media, which is kind of like the Canadian Condé Nast. Mm-hmm. And there's 12 magazines at that company. I was a magazine designer at one of the titles. And at some point we had like an office Christmas party.
Yeah.
And I was talking to the CEO of the company, and I was like, oh yeah, like for some reason we were talking about the web, and it was early days of the web. It was like the kind of 2008, 2009, like at a time when magazines were really starting to take the internet seriously, and they were building blogs and social media presences and so on. And I was sort of critical of like what the websites that we had were and how they could be so much better, and did my like off the cuff pitch as to how the magazines could be better. And I found like a week later, I was offered this job as like the head of digital to like put all these ideas into practice. And so I made this transition, and I remember at the time like talking to colleagues of mine who were like, oh, you're going to go work in the web? Like, it's such a step down from being a print magazine designer.
Wow.
Like, you're, the web, like, who wants to be part of that? Like, it's just trash. Like, and I was like, I think the web's the future. Like, this is like a lot of those people I know, this is like 20 years ago now, but like a lot of those people who were like, we're going to be print designers till the end, like suddenly found themselves out of jobs because those magazines closed.
Jeez.
And like all the websites are now what a lot of these titles are and what these brands have become.
Dang.
But so I made this really opportune, like I was a really good time for me to make that shift. And so I ended up becoming the head of digital for this magazine company. And it was my job to rethink magazine titles as how they could be web properties and how we could create social media followings and how we could create blogs. And it's funny, I think about like, it's one of the rare times that like Zen Buddhism has been like really the best thing I could have gone to school for. I had this teacher, Robert Scharf, who was like a Zen Buddhist, and he would give us these really like amazing, inspiring lectures. And he had this one lecture which he was trying to talk about this idea of impermanence, that one of the central things in Zen is that we get kind of attached to ideas or we get attached to things, and that we have trouble seeing that things are just like a construction of concepts. So it was my example. He took his chair that he had behind his desk and he put it on his desk and he said, "What is this?" And everyone in the room was like, "It's a chair." And he's like, "Okay." And he put the chair upside down and he said, "What is this?" And we're like, "Well, it's just an upside down chair." And then he got out like a pocket, like a screwdriver.
Yeah.
And he started taking the chair apart. And he took it apart, took all the pieces apart, and he stacked all the pieces on his desk. And he's like, "Is this still a chair?" And we're like, "Sort of." It's like an IKEA chair, like it's been disassembled, but it's still a chair. And then he took all the pieces and he started putting them in different corners of the classroom. And he's like, "Is this still a chair?" And we're like, "Well, no." And he's like, "Well, where did the chair go?" Like, because the chair was really your construction of like what this thing was. And when I was working in this magazine world and having to like reconsider a magazine as a digital property, that was something I always thought about, was like, what is the extent of what this brand is, this city magazine or this wedding magazine or this fashion magazine? What is the DNA of that we need to keep? If we're doing a Twitter feed, what are the things that make this magazine what it is, that are the essential like chairness of this magazine that we need to maintain, even if it's in a totally fragmented and different environment? And so I applied a lot of that thinking to this job, and I was really good at it. And I ran a team of 30 people, and we was like editors and designers and people doing coding and marketing. And collectively, we won like 27 national awards for all the work we were doing, because we were just like a team. We were like on fire, and we were just like making these amazing websites, and was winning awards and huge traffic numbers. And in the middle of all that, the iPad was invented. And I was like, the iPad is something we should be paying attention to. And I had an idea for like an iPad magazine that was like a kind of iPad only digital thing, and you'd swipe. And at the time, a lot of the ideas around iPad magazines, this is to me, like, it sounds bonkers when I say all this aloud, because at the time, these were like genuine conversations we were having. But like today, the web is so different than it was, 10 years ago.
Right.
But at the time it was like, oh, we're going to take this magazine that we're going to make a PDF of it, and then you'll just flip through it on your iPad screen. Like, and it's like, why would you do that? Like, it's no one reads that way on an iPad. So I had this idea to make a magazine that was really like designed for iPads, swiping, animated covers and so on. The company wasn't that interested in doing the idea. So I quit and I did this magazine. And I won a big national award for it, and it was like people talked about it. It was exciting. And one day, out of the blue, Amazon calls me on the phone, and they're like, "Hey, do you want to work for Amazon?" Like we want to hire you to like work on stuff. And it's a weird experience. Like I'm Canadian. I'm like living in Toronto. I have a house. I have a family. I have like, I've got friends. We're well established in Toronto.
Yeah.
And but it is this experience of like it's like getting called up to the the All-Star team.
Yeah.
And it's a chance to work on something big and global and exciting. And I'd never been to Seattle before. I didn't know anything about Seattle. I don't know the politics of Amazon. Like you only get Amazon's version of the story.
Right.
So
right.
it's very positive and enthusiastic. And so you come here and you're like excited because you've got this new job and you like arrive at Amazon. And for me, like, South Lake Union is just this kind of walled garden of Amazon people. Like there's apartments and people live in South Lake Union. They work in South Lake Union. They don't really engage with the larger city. Like so many people that I worked with at Amazon really treated their time there like doing like a tour of duty in the military, where it's like you're going to go be stationed somewhere for 2 years and you're not putting down roots. You're not trying to learn about the place. You're just there to do your job. And a lot of people, it's funny you said it's about the NAST with the radio in your mind, but like a lot of people work at Amazon so they can have Amazon on their resume so that they can leverage that to get a different job somewhere else. And I'm not saying that's a universal truth, but like I found that experience that there's a lot of people who are at the company for a couple of years and then they move on. And there's almost a culture of like high turnover at Amazon that is like by design.
Maybe that's why, like I had Guy Keltner of the Acid Tongue.
I don't know that name.
It's like one of the bigger bands in Seattle, and he has a thing where he doesn't like tech companies.
Yeah,
I don't want to put words in his mouth, but during the podcast he was talking about reasons he doesn't like tech companies and about how when these tech people move here, they're not interested in enhancing the culture of Seattle. And then you just added a point where like some of them move here, not even to lay roots. I have a friend who is basically about to get a great job in tech, and his dream job is to be a music producer. And then I think about my friends that I have that are or damn near close to being homeless from just doing music.
Sure.
And that's their entire life, and they they rather do that than work a corporate job, like I have so many friends. Well, as they get older, like I doubt fucking like I consider Greg Cypher a friend. I doubt he would be like, fuck a corporate job. He probably understands that he needs to make some money and also find a way to do his craft as well, right? But like some of my younger friends, like they rather either just do the gig economy or do whatever so they can truly just focus on music. They rather have 8 roommates versus work at Amazon. Sure. That's just like, I don't know if that's ego or whatever the situation is, but I see both sides. Like my friend, this specific friend, he has a total different, I feel like it's a different experience than any other people, like how his family moved here and all that. And then maybe you kind of have to look about why are certain people go into like Amazon, right? Like for my friend, for example, his family is like Ethiopian, right? Yeah. And then like if you're already like migrating here, right? You're not going to just come here to mess around. You want to get a fucking good job, Sure. So you get this good job, and then you still have like hobbies outside of that. Just because you work at Amazon or whatever doesn't mean that's, like you were saying, that's not the only thing you love in your life. So what's the difference between having the extra money and being able to do your craft versus doing your craft and having no money? Like some people, there's just like there's just two sides to the coin, and like I understand both sides, and I believe, like I've talked about enough on the podcast that it's been like 3 months now or so. This guy working, I forget the name of the company. He's this Indian guy that works at this tech company in Seattle, and out of the blue he emailed me and just wanted to meet for coffee and said he had listened to the podcast and about me talking about tech and how he just wanted to bounce some ideas off of me on like how he feels that tech people can connect more with the music scene in Seattle. Yeah. And that's still something I think about a lot, like why I feel like there should be more blending of some way or another of tech and music, and maybe that uplifts the culture more, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so when I moved to Seattle, I had this connection to working at Amazon.
Yeah.
But I didn't, I had worked in magazines. I had done, I was really interested in like cultural life of the city because I worked in a lot of like city magazines that were covering arts and covering restaurants. So something like Seattle Met or The Stranger, like covered the kind of beats that I was really interested in and that I would be involved in Toronto. And so, when I first moved here, it was kind of the end of the age of like MP3 blogs around that time, where there were a bunch of blogs that were covering local music, and they all sort of folded right around the time I moved here. There was 206 Up, there was Three Imaginary Girls, there was Miss Casey Carter's blog, and these were all places where you could learn about local music and local hip hop and shows that were happening. And I started going to shows. Like I would sort of go randomly to shows. I went to see rock shows. I went to see hip hop shows, and
you didn't care how big the big of the artist or anything.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I was just really interested in learning about the cultural life of the city.
Got it.
And I had briefly, before I was in Seattle, I briefly lived in Bushwick in New York, and Bushwick was at the time, it was like 2012. It was like a time when that was like Brooklyn was like the epicenter of cultural stuff. It seemed there was just a lot of music and cool restaurants. There was a restaurant called Roberta's Pizza, like that was a block from my apartment, and so I was at Roberta's like once a week, and I was at this super hip restaurant that everyone was always talking about and celebrities would show up at. One night it was closed because like the president went and had pizza there. Like it was an interesting experience, but there were also like this really interesting, there were like a lot of rooftop parties, and a band would be playing on like this rooftop of a building, and you'd have to sort of finagle your way into the building to like get up onto the rooftop to see this show. And these weren't like shows that were like exclusive or secret. They were like just secret because nobody could be bothered to like advertise them or talk about what was happening. And when I first moved to Seattle, I was like, I bet this same thing is happening here somewhere. And I don't know where, but I want to find it because I'm interested in like being part of whatever culturally is happening here. And I remember early on there were like shows at places like Candy Mountain and the Anthill and the Fortress, which were all people's basements, and you had to know the right person, and you had to kind of know the address, and you showed up and you hoped it was like, I remember I went to a show that was at the back of like an auto garage in Soto, and it was a phenomenal show, but it was just in like an old auto garage. Like it was anyway, where am I going with this? So when I first moved here, we were talking about like, how do you connect these scenes? This kind of like the newcomer scene of like, say, new people from Amazon with like the local music scene. And when I was at Amazon, I actually started doing a lot of things internally. Like there's internal message boards. There's a whole community of stuff like that you can find out if you need information about like cool restaurants to eat at. There's some internal like community board you can go to and like get that information. That's all Amazonians talking to other Amazonians. And so I started a whole bunch of like community threads on like local hip hop and local music in order to try to foster like more interest in local music. And I found it wasn't that successful. And I reflect a lot on why that was. And part of it is that, if you're interested in local music and what's happening in Seattle, you're kind of a special person already. Right. Like I would meet people all the time who would be like, "Oh, you like hip hop? Well, I love hip hop. I'm really into Drake and Kanye and like, have you heard the new whatever Kendrick Lamar record?" And it's like, okay, but what about like all the people who are making hip hop here in Seattle? Like there's a whole history of hip hop in here. Like people have been making hip hop in Seattle since 1983, 1981. And for me, like I learned a lot about the kind of the cultural life of Seattle, about gentrification from listening to hip hop records and getting the perspective of someone who lives in the CD, what they think about Seattle, about going to Azell's to get a snack pack or what. And I learned about a lot of things in the city through hip hop. Like for me, that was the kind of it's the cheesy thing to say, like the poetry of the streets or something. But like I really did learn a lot about like life in Seattle from listening to hip hop music. And then I would try to convey this to coworkers of mine, like, oh, you got to check out this album, you got to see this artist. And I found also I met a lot of people, and I don't know if this is just because if you work in tech, you're either wired differently or you just think about like you're just not that interested in music in the first place. And so I would meet someone who would say, oh yeah, I'm really into music. And I'd be like, oh, great. Like hey, there's this cool hip hop show happening on Friday and it's going to be at Chop Suey and we should go check it out. Chop Suey is a venue in Seattle.
Yes.
But I would have trouble getting someone to come out.
Yeah.
But that same person would show up for work. They would put their headphones in. They would press play on the Spotify algorithm and listen to music for 8 hours while they wrote code. But the purpose of the music wasn't to listen to it or absorb it. It was to have white noise to tune out the world so I can write computer code. So music is like almost viewed for that person, like music is wallpaper. Like they're not looking for music they want to engage with. They're looking for music they can ignore. And that was a thing that I found hard to overcome, is that if someone isn't really interested in the music they're listening to in the first place, it's hard to engage with them on music. And so anyway, but that was sort of for me, like how I found community initially when I moved here, especially community outside of Amazon, was by going to hip hop shows. And, you know, I would be the old white guy who would show up in the room. And sometimes I'd be going to the basement show in, you know, somewhere in the North End, and everybody else in the room is 23 and is looking at me like, are you lost, sir? Are you like, can we help you? But what happened was because I do stand out, like people started knowing who I was.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when I first moved to Seattle, Instagram was like brand new. And I started an Instagram account, which was like, hey, I'm going to have an Instagram account, everybody. Like, it's like having email in the 90s. It's like, I'm going to be on Instagram now. And I started this Instagram account, which was mainly like Gary's Adventures in Seattle. Where the intended audience were my friends and family back in Toronto. Like it was like, we're not going to see each other a lot. Here's a way to keep up with what I've got going on in my life. And as I went to more hip hop shows, there was this, as I said, this weird time when all these MP3 blogs were sort of dying off. And this Larry Mizell Jr. had been a longtime columnist about hip hop in The Stranger, and he stopped writing about hip hop in 2014, around the same time I was doing this Instagram account. And this odd thing happened that a lot of people in the hip hop community thought I was like a journalist covering hip hop and started following me and started like replying me and started like DMing me to be like, hey, you should come to my show. It's happening on Friday and here's the password to get in or whatever that was. And there was this strange thing that happened where suddenly like I was like the most famous person in hip hop who wasn't on stage. Like I would show up at a show and people on the stage would like shout me out. There was this one rapper at one point at a show who like made a whole verse about me and then got the audience to sing it like while I was in the room. Like It was funny. Like it's a strange experience for me because I didn't start any of this to like be known or famous or whatever that was. Like I just went to shows because I was interested in the music. And yeah, you know, I guess because a lot of other people who are in their 40s and look like me don't come to shows, like I stand out. But at the same time, like I was just interested in music and interested in like seeing what was going on.
And then how long into that did you end up creating Crane City? So
I moved here, as I said, at the start of late 2012, early 2013 is when I moved here. And I sort of wrote about hip hop on Instagram for probably 3 years. Like I was, and it was a slow evolution. Like it started out as just Gary's Adventures in Seattle. Once there was this obvious like dynamic happening between me and the hip hop community where people were asking me to come to shows, I was going to shows, I would post little Instagram clips, video clips of shows that I went to. At some point I I started writing record reviews.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd go to a show and people would sell CDs, or people would hand me their CD, or people were still doing CDs at the time, or people would give me their link to their Bandcamp and say, hey, go download my album.
Yeah.
And I was interested in kind of exploring music and seeing what everyone had going on. So I started writing a lot of record reviews, and I would just say, hey, this is a Jar of D record that I just got, and here's what I liked about it. And oftentimes I was the only person who had ever written a review of this record because it was a lot of independent DIY self-released music. And at some point I had written like 300 record reviews over the course of a couple of years.
And were they honest, or were they all mostly good, nice, or were some of them like they lack the whatever?
I had a tendency that if I really didn't like something, I didn't review it at all.
Right.
Like
okay,
it's
fair.
just there's no point in me saying like this sucks. Like that serves nothing and doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
Records that I love are easy to write about.
Yeah.
The things that I found tough to write about were records that were just fine. Like, yep, it's a rap record. It sounds fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
And like that was always a challenge for me to say, like, do I write about this at all if I'm just okay with it? Does it help anyone for me to be like, yeah, I don't know, it's good. Like,
yeah.
Or like, should I try to talk about it? Should I talk about the positives and the strengths and the weaknesses? Like, it's not really my job to tell someone what they're doing. But, you know, at the same time, like I find like one of the things that I see over and over again in music, especially in local music, and there's a lot of rap music that comes out of a culture of like struggle rap, I would describe, where it's like someone who hasn't had opportunities, hasn't had the chances to be where they would like to be. That's, I think, a universal feeling we all have.
Yeah.
And there was this one rap record that I will not say what it is, but like the rapper's songs, like song after song, is like, when I have the mic, you're really gonna know what I'm all about. Like someday when everyone's listening to me, you're gonna know what my views on things are.
Yeah.
And I saw this artist perform at one point, and he was performing these songs, and the whole time the irony of like, you're holding the mic, like we're all in the room.
Yeah.
Like it's like you've spent so much of your time in your career focused on the struggle that when you actually like have made it in some level, like you don't have anything to say. Like, and that's such a disappointment. It's like, what do you, like, climate change is a thing. Like, can you rap about that? Like, can you convince people to do more recycling? Like, I don't know what, but it's like, there's so many things in the world that we should be taking action on. We should, like, when you have a microphone and you're in front of a group of people, like, are you using that opportunity to talk about something that's worth talking about?
Yeah. So with that, going to hip hop shows since the early 2010 era, isn't that so cool? We can say the 2010 era now.
Yeah, I know.
2010s. You've probably seen so many artists, even a lot of artists with potential, fall off, or you still see them making music to this day, but it doesn't seem like they've moved. It just seems like they've moved laterally in Seattle. What has that been? How has that been like for you to witness things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like I think there's this common like human. We do something and we have a level of success. Like I asked online yesterday on my Instagram, like, does anyone have any questions they want like me to talk about? And they want me to talk about when I'm on the podcast. And so I posted this on Instagram, and the only responses I got were from people who were asking when I was going to do something again. So it's like, oh, you made this movie about hip hop, so when are you making the next movie about local hip hop? Or I did a compilation album in 2017 with a bunch of local artists, and it's like, when are you doing the next compilation? And I personally am not someone who likes to repeat things. Like it's like when I've done something, like if I'm going to go back to that well and do it again, like how am I going to make it interesting if I do this a second time? Like I made this movie called Newcomer, and I took all of my Instagram clips from a year of Instagram So I was saying I was shooting Instagram clips. Let me go back to your original question, which is that I was shooting Instagram clips from like 2013 on to, I mean, I still shoot Instagram clips when I'm at shows. But in 2019, there was the Seattle Hip Hop Film Festival, first year of the Seattle Hip Hop Film Festival at Washington Hall.
What the? I never even heard of this.
Yeah, and so they've done 2 or 3 years of it now.
What the?
And it's a group of people who are passionate about hip hop. It's a group called, it's affiliated with 206 Zulu, which is a chapter of the Zulu Nation that's based in Seattle. They're based out of Washington Hall. And what I should clarify is that the Seattle Hip Hop Film Festival is not a film festival of Seattle movies. It's a hip hop movies from all around the world that they show. It just happens to be the Seattle edition of this hip hop film festival.
Got it.
But the first year they were doing that, they asked me for help with some promotion, and because I have this Instagram. I have a lot of Instagram followers, and they were like, "Hey, could you help promote this event? We would love your help with it." And I thought, I've got all these clips on my phone from years of hip hop shows, so maybe I can put together like a highlight reel of like the best of the year. And I started going through my phone, and I was like, I had hours and hours of footage, like just an unbelievable amount of footage. And some of the footage was like moments that for me felt like the Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar on fire kind of moments. Like I was probably the only person at this show who shot this clip of this moment. And so I really wanted to collect together all of these clips. And so I started going through this like process of like trying to make sense of years of Instagram footage. And some of it was poorly shot, some of it was the sound was terrible, I was beside the speaker, and trying to make sense of what all of that was in order to create like a story that I could tell about the scene from my experience of the years that I've been kind of covering the scene and involved with the scene. And I have seen a lot. Like I've seen artists who've come and gone and artists who continue to thrive. And I think there's a really, like, going back to your original question about like seeing the evolution of artists, what's amazing to me is how much the values of tech have in some ways found their way into the everyday culture of people who live in Seattle. And I want to explain this point is that tech people have a tendency to walk into some situation that they have no experience in and say, we're going to reinvent this thing and make it brand new. Like I worked on a project at Amazon to make a magazine, and I was the only person on the team who ever worked at a magazine. And everybody else in the room was just like, oh, who cares? Like, we're just going to make magazines again. Like, we're going to reinvent the magazine. And it was so insulting to the fact that, like, there's a whole, like, tradition and history and, like, there's a way things are done. And I'm not saying that we have to be slavish to tradition, but, like, we need to be respectful of what has happened before us.
Yeah.
And the thing I find in hip-hop in Seattle in particular is that I constantly meet young artists who know nothing about hip hop in the city prior to like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, someone will say to me like, oh, we got to talk about an OG like Jarv D or Saul. And these guys who really came up in like 2010 are treated like they're like the OGs of the scene.
Yeah.
As if somehow like there weren't people making hip hop in the 80s.
Yeah.
And some of those guys who were making hip hop in the 80s, I just put a record out with this guy, Specs Wizard. Specs Wizard is my age. He's like in his 50s. And he has been making hip hop in Seattle consistently since 1988. And he puts out an album every year, every couple years. He's still putting out albums. He's put out like 25 albums. And amazingly talented person, but gets no real respect or recognition for the fact that he's just grinding every day. He's grinding and making music. Vitamin D is a phenomenally talented producer. His first group, Ghetto Children, put out their first cassette in 92. And so he's been making music since 92. And that's, decades of making amazing hip hop in the city and phenomenally talented. But again, I don't think a lot of young people, maybe Vitamin D, because he's started to get a real cult status in the city. I think a lot of young rappers, he's been working with a lot of young talent lately. But I find like, I don't think a lot of people know like the huge wealth of hip hop music he's made over the past, whatever, 20, 30 years. And that's the thing that I feel like I wish there was more awareness.
Does that come from lack of media attention?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's part of it. And I think also we just don't, there's such a focus on, hip hop came from New York, and everyone knows the New York story of hip hop and the NWA West Coast side of that story. And then there's so much discussion around like mainstream music that the references that everyone has is to Kanye and Kendrick and Soulja Boy or whatever. Like no one's looking back through Seattle's history. I think the other thing I would say about Seattle hip hop in particular is that the vast majority of it, a huge percentage of it, was DIY self-released. And the problem is that, so I've been writing a book about the early days of Northwest hip hop, the first decade. So
have you been interviewing?
I've talked to some people. I'm working up to that. But like what I've been really interested in is that the first decade, which starts in 81 and goes to sort of 92, 93, which is otherwise the Mix-a-Lot years. So that's like Sir Mix-a-Lot was huge. There was this record label, Nasty Mix, which was his record label, self-released DIY record label. Nasty Mix was this huge like sensation in the hip hop world in the late 80s and early 90s. And then all that history was just erased and washed away by grunge, because grunge blows up in 91. That's when you have the holy trinity of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden all drop records at the end of 91. And the pivot of Seattle music just ignores hip hop and goes straight into grunge, and hip hop goes completely underground. And there's a really famous story that like Vitamin D's first group, Ghetto Children, signed a major label record deal with Geffen. So they were the people who put out Nirvana, and so Ghetto Children were going to be like the hip hop Nirvana. But the Geffen people had been working with the Beastie Boys and the Dust Brothers, who did Paul's Boutique, and they were like, we're gonna get these guys to produce your record. So they were basically saying to Vitamin D, who's a very talented producer, we just need you to show up at the recording studio and sing your raps on top of like, we're gonna have other people make the music.
Yeah.
And he and the Ghetto Children like walked away from the deal. They were just like, no, like we want to be authentic. We want to be at our own thing. We want to be at our own music. And that attitude, I think, is very much what has informed Northwest hip hop, like ever since. Like I think in some ways grunge kind of like drove the scene underground.
Right.
And this sense of like distrust, because grunge was really a time when like major labels came in and just strip mined the city. If you could play guitar, you were a grunge band, and suddenly you got a major label record deal. And a lot of crap came out like for a lot of years from the city, because a lot of people who got put on were just, people who had the right connections or whatever. But, Cobain died in 94. So I was 21.
Yeah.
And
shit, a lot happened when you were 21 then, man.
1994. Yeah.
Jeez.
Pre-Y2K. That's when we all thought the world was going to end.
Yeah. That's so wild.
That was we were pretty sure that was like, I remember in 1999 having like a party at my apartment, and like a bunch of friends came.
So Y2K was about the numbers not lining up or something. What was it? Something about the internet.
So a lot of number systems. So like, in the late 90s, like computers had only been around for like 10 years, 15 years. And a lot of earlier computers, like computers from the 70s, only had 2-digit numbers systems. So there was like counting from 77, 78, 79, 98, 99. And then the next number after 99 was 0.
Yeah.
And there was concern that there were a lot of, not like day-to-day, like not people's laptops and stuff, but like, there's computer systems that manage the Hoover Dam. There's computer systems that manage nuclear missile sites. There's computer systems that manage like these old industrial, like whatever computer systems and there was just not a lot of clarity as to what was going to happen if they experienced this bug. And so, in going into like Y2K, like it was this mass effort of like computer scientists and computer people like all around the world trying to vet computer systems to make sure they weren't going to break when the date switched over from 99 to 1000 to whatever 2000. But at the time, like we didn't really know like that there's a movie that came out in the late 90s called Until the End of the World.
Okay.
And the movie is more or less about like Y2K's like worst case scenario happening. And but I remember on that New Year's Eve 1999, like having a party, and like one of my friends like brought like bottled water and like supplies. Like we were like ready to, if we had to like live in our apartment for a week because it was going to be chaos outside, the world was going to end, nuclear missiles were going to launch, like who knows what was going to happen. So
damn.
Yeah.
And then now none of us even think about that.
Yeah, I know. Nothing happened, and we were all like, "Oh, that wasn't a big deal." But you could also argue that like nothing happened because for the 5 years previous to that, huge investment went into updating all these computer systems.
Right. So we don't know if no one actually put effort into it, maybe something would have happened.
Maybe.
Damn. Is it worth watching that movie, or am I going to be disappointed?
The director who did the movie, Wim Wenders, he's a German film director. The movie's in English. Actually, it's in a bunch of languages, but it's mostly in English. He recently re-released it as like a 6-hour director's cut.
Yeah.
So when it came out in theaters, it was like 2 hours long, and it didn't make a lot of sense. And then he went back, and I guess he'd shot like 6 hours worth of footage that never made it into them. So I watched it recently because it's online. I think it's on YouTube.
Okay.
But I watched it in like kind of like a TV show.
Yeah.
Like I just watched like an hour every so often, and it was like binge watching a TV show.
Yeah.
And it was kind of fun to watch. So I recommend it. It's interesting. But
I'll
it's like
check it
also
out.
like it's kind of interesting throwback because it's like takes place in, as I said, like this kind of Y2K era. So their idea of like what the future is going to be is also, because I think the movie was made in like 92 or 93. So they were trying to guess what 2000 was going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has this interesting like, people are really into VR in a way that like never happened, or at least it hasn't happened till now.
Yeah.
Like, people have like Oculuses on, like they're doing VR, but it's like, it's all pixels.
Shit.
It's funny.
That's pretty fun. So when did Crane City become more of a record label?
Oh, we got to talk about music. Okay, good.
Yeah, we got to talk about everything.
So
what time is it?
So Crane.
Oh shit.
We're like way over time.
Yeah, I'm supposed to pick someone up for the show. We should do a part. Oh, why is there a YouTube video of? I was looking up cameras.
I'm happy to do a part 2 if you want to do.
Yeah, let's do a part 2. You're
We'll
very interesting. Yeah, you're. This has been the introduction. Is it introductory?
Sure.
Introductory episode of Gary Campbell. He's an Amazon guy. He's a tech guy. He's a magazine
I'm
guy.
I'm not a tech guy.
Well, I feel like if you're at Amazon, you count as a tech guy.
Yeah, I only worked there for a few years.
He's not a tech guy. He's a magazine guy. He's a music guy. He has a pandemic beard. He's a Canadian. There's a lot about this guy. He's a Buddhist.
Yeah, I mean
sometimes a Buddhist. There will be a lot more to come. You're gonna be a returning guest for sure. How about what is some advice that you have for up and coming artists, creators, influencers?
There's this great piece of advice that Larry Mizell Jr. said in a movie. There was a movie called The Other Side about Seattle hip hop, and Larry is interviewed in it, and he says this really simple thing, which is just be good. Like work at your craft, learn history, and like pay attention to what other people are doing. Like, I think there's a tendency for a lot of young artists to be very like myopic in that they listen to music that they like,
mm-hmm.
and they try to make music that is like the music they like. And like, listen to some classical music, listen to some reggae, listen to some like goth music. Like, it's like there's so much out there to inform what you're doing. Listen to stuff you don't like. and learn why you don't like it.
Yeah.
Like I think that's the thing that I find is there's so many young hip hop artists whose kind of thing is just emulation. It's like, I like Frank Ocean, so I'm making music that sounds like Frank Ocean. And, sure, copying is a whole artistic tradition of like copying things to learn how they're made and learn how to make them better.
Yeah.
People used to paint Picasso, like paint beside what a Picasso looked like so they could understand how a Picasso worked. But I think there's also a desire to kind of get outside of emulation and have something to say. Like, it's what do you think about the challenges in life? What do you think about the pandemic? What do you think about climate change? Like, what do you think about the possible overturning of Roe v. Wade? Like, there's stuff going on in the world that is worth commenting on and thinking about. And that's what I'd say.
Hell yeah.
Okay.
I think it's been almost 2 hours. Like,
oh, God. Sorry.
No, this has been
I got to go
great.
meet with somebody too.
Oh, wow. This has been fun. Like I said, you'll definitely be back so we could talk about music.
Sure.
This has been such a good origin episode, though, right?
Okay.
This has been great.
It's like the special issue of the comic book.
Yes. 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 We did it. This is the NAST podcast. Wait, what is the easiest way to reach you, by the way?
I'm on Instagram.
Okay.
Crane City Music.
CRANE City Music.
Thanks.
And this is the NAST podcast with
Gary Campbell.
And we did it.